For all of its flaws, the sequel trilogy got one thing right. The origin stories for Finn and Rey were some of the most intriguing I'd ever heard. We meet a kidnapped child turned brainwashed slave soldier and an abandoned orphan doing everything she can to survive in an incredibly harsh and unforgiving world. Fate throws them into an adventure, forcing them both to learn to love and trust for the first time in their lives. Now, yes, you could argue that some of the character traits I just described are shown in the film. However, the characters I just described are almost the exact opposite of what Rey and Finn turned out to be. Let's break down their characters, explore the actual personality traits they should have displayed, and discuss the way their character arcs should actually have progressed. This is the story of Rey, who I think is one of the most wasted characters in film history. Now, one huge argument a lot of people are going to make is that an accurate description of real-world psychological trauma isn't what Star Wars is about, and people don't want to see that in their entertainment. And I agree, that's exactly why so many of us had an issue with the broken hobo Luke. But since they decided to go with this story, they should have done it correctly. Rey's character doesn't ring true, and on some level the audience feels that. I am talking about something very subtle, something in the background that most of the audience won't consciously think about. Rey doesn't make sense. And I'm talking beyond her crazy force powers.
Oh, and he can't stay here forever. Most of his friends have gone. It means so much to him.
I'll make it up to him next year. I promise.
Luke's just not a farmer, Owen. He has too much of his father in him.
That's what I'm afraid of.
Luke had a loving family. Luke had his own bed, food on the table every day. He had friends and free time and hobbies. He is well-adjusted socially. We see that he is an average teenager who had an average childhood, and in the back of our minds, we can feel that this character makes sense. But Rey grew up the opposite of Luke in every way. No loving home, no family, no friends, nothing but hardship and the constant threat of starvation. And yet she is well-adjusted socially, easily makes friends, easily trusts others. She doesn't suffer a single lasting consequence from enduring 14 years of isolation, starvation, and constant physical threats. In the back of our minds, the audience feels this, that something about her feels off. And Rey could very easily have had the same childhood that Luke did. She could have been left as a child with this man, who loved her as a grandfather and raised her and trained her to be the well-adjusted, amiable young woman that we see, so that her character arc feels right to the audience. But Disney decided to go this route instead, a decision which completely breaks the believability of her character. Now, before anybody starts complaining that I'm overthinking or overanalyzing, let's start off by addressing how important this entire topic is to story crafting. We have been conditioned to accept poor character development, that good storytelling doesn't matter. As long as you were entertained, it was a good film. But a good writer will have thought through the entire backstory of a character, even if none of that story ever comes across on film. Because that backstory is important. That backstory that we never see affects every decision the character will make on screen. Watch this clip.
Never again.
This scene is powerful. This scene is important. And this scene only works because the writers knew the backstory and how that history would affect the character in this moment. Even if a Batman film never shows the death of Thomas and Martha, even if that is never mentioned in the film, that is the entire spine of Bruce's character. The single defining moment that changed his life, and the fact that it isn't in the film doesn't change the fact that the writer needs to know that backstory in order to properly write the character. Backstory is important. Ned is haunted by the death of his sister and the secret he carries, but the show doesn't reveal that truth for 6 more seasons. How could anybody properly write his character if they didn't know that backstory?
She must have been a rare wench to make Lord Eddard Stark forget his honour. He never told me what she looked like.
Promise me, Ned. Promise me.
No, will I?
In season 1 of The Witcher, we know next to nothing about Geralt's backstory. He's haunted by something. What he's haunted by is obviously affecting his actions in the show, but we don't actually see what it is. But the writers must know. Is he haunted because a little girl died in front of him? Then the show needs to have him react a certain way whenever he sees a little girl. Is he haunted because his mother abandoned him? Then he needs to react a certain way whenever he speaks to or about a mother. Tom Holland's Spider-Man never actually addresses his parents' or Uncle Ben's death, but it's obvious in his personality that he's desperately needing a father figure in his life. This is what proper character development is. It is something that we don't always see, but it is something that we can always feel. First off, in order to really understand Rey, we need to take a look at the spine of Han's character, and why the Han shot first incident was such a big deal. When the special editions were created in 1997, one of the many changes made was this scene. Now, most people probably never thought twice about this change, but it's actually a dramatic one. It changes the basis of Han's character from someone who kills in cold blood to someone who isn't that bad of a guy, he was just defending himself. This is who Han Solo originally was, a cruel, lonely man who went through a fantastic growth arc to not only having friends, but being willing to die for them. This is the basis of the character arc we should have seen from Rey, only to a far, far greater extent, because when you analyze her backstory, her life was far rougher than it first appears. The spine of Rey's character was simple. Abandoned as a child, having grown up alone, she learned how to fend for herself. But under these circumstances, childhood development isn't so simple. Let's take a look at the woman Rey should have been when Finn first met her. Rey's life begins here. Now, we can assume she had a normal, loving childhood until this point, but let me ask you this. How much of your life do you remember from when you were 5 years old? So like I said, her life begins here. Any loving memories she had of a family would quickly fade as struggling to survive in this harsh environment consumed her. And again, try to think back to when you were 5. If you went months or even years without seeing your aunt or uncle, could you still clearly remember what they looked like? I vividly remember once asking when we were going to get to see Aunt Kay again, because it had been so long I was having trouble remembering what she looked like. There is a well-documented phenomenon in human development called childhood amnesia. It has to do with the 2 types of memories that we form, which are either specific or emotional. Until roughly the age of 7, kids tend to only retain their emotional memories. They don't remember anything they did at Disney World, they just remember loving it. I couldn't remember specifically what my aunt looked like or what we did together, I just remembered that I loved being around her. That's what makes Rey's story even more tragic. Rey's one desire in life was for her family to come back, but she wouldn't even have recognized them if they did. Now, I'm sure some of you are making an argument right now regarding the Force, saying it helped her survive and helped her remember her family. But that's not the premise of the film. The entire premise is that
there's been an awakening. Have you felt it?
It's part of the plot. The Force was lying dormant in Rey, and the first time she accessed it was with Finn. Which, yes, breaks canon, but at the same time is also kind of cool. She doesn't survive this desolation because she was born with a magical cheat code. She survived through pure grit and determination. So we know that the Force didn't help her survive, and we also know that Unkar Plutt, who she was left with, didn't help her survive. He takes advantage of her, tries to steal from her. Even as a crying child, she got no pity from him.
Quiet, girl.
And this is where the film takes a dramatic turn from a realistic character arc. Rey would not have been this smiling, optimistic, friendly, trusting woman. She would have grown up to be like Han, stealing, lying, cheating, possibly even killing, doing absolutely whatever it took to survive. Remember how important backstory is. Everything about Batman is influenced by his parents being killed. Everything about Harry was influenced by this one event. Everything about the Doctor's character is influenced by his decision in the Time War. Rey being abandoned by her parents at such a young age is the single biggest defining aspect of her character development. Now, one thing they probably accidentally got correct was her age. Rey was roughly 5 years old when she was left on Jakku. At this point, she had already gone through all of the most important mental, physical, and emotional learning stages of young childhood. And based off the fact that she's not dressed in rags, looks clean and healthy, and is calling for her parents to come back, we can safely assume that she grew up in a loving, functional home. We can safely assume that she's mentally, physically, and socially where a normal 5-year-old should be developmentally. But after age 5 is the period of development in which a child starts drifting away from their parents and really begins proper social development. And Rey has no one. She never develops those social skills the rest of us take for granted. Then, given time, the childhood amnesia slowly sets in. Rey begins to forget her life before Jakku. Now all she knows is that the adults in charge are abusive and that they can't be trusted. And not only does Unkar Plutt starve her and try to steal from her, he also refuses to ever call her by name. This action demeans her, and she would grow up thinking that she is worthless, with a name not even worth repeating.
Quiet, girl. Follow the girl and get that droid.
Now, like I said, a lot of people probably don't want this level of realism in an adventure movie about space wizards, but consider how compelling this realistic depiction could have made her character. People could have identified so closely with her if she showed overcoming the adversity of her tough childhood. It's easy enough to say, well, Rey was strong enough to overcome her childhood trauma and not be affected as an adult. But that's simply not true. Childhood trauma affects the biochemicals in your brain. It is a mental scar that will always be there and always affect you. Childhood trauma is encoded in our brains as adults. We can never forget it, and it affects all of our actions in the present. And as a final example, this article sums up the problem with Rey perfectly. Children do not just get over trauma, they live with the consequences for a lifetime. Children adapt so they can cope, but if they are emotionally overwhelmed, their brain goes into survival mode, which changes the way it grows and develops. An early traumatic experience has a profound effect on the way in which a child's brain forms and functions. A brain that grows in response to a perceived threat is in overdrive and senses threat everywhere. I mentioned earlier how a child really begins their social development around age 7, but what we haven't yet discussed is how damaging social isolation actually is. The beginning of the film goes to great lengths to show how alone Rey is, to show that she is utterly isolated and has no one she can depend upon nor trust. And that isolation is way more damaging than you'd think. It negatively affects the neuroendocrine, immune, and autonomic nervous systems. The description of what isolation does to you is incredibly chilling. I haven't had a friend in over 10 years, and I don't use a strict definition for that term. No friends, acquaintances, family, co-workers. There's literally no one I speak to. I haven't had a conversation with someone in over a year. The effects? Everything that can malfunction will malfunction. This isn't an idealistic portrayal where someone communes with nature and attains enlightenment. It kills everything human about you and destroys your ability to function. This is what Rey suffered through for 14 years before she met Finn. A loneliness so deep that it kills everything human in you. Now that we've discussed the mental and social aspects of Rey's character development, let's look at an important part of her physical health. This is another thing that the filmmakers sort of got right. Rey should have been utterly obsessed with food. Her entire existence is dedicated to scavenging parts that she can trade for food so that she doesn't starve. Now, let's analyze what we see her eat on Jakku. Most people probably don't realize these are the equivalent of modern-day military MREs, meals ready to eat. Each MRE provides an average of 1,250 calories, 13% protein, 36% fat, and 51% carbohydrates, and each is 1/3 of the military recommended daily allowance of vitamins and minerals. A full day's worth of meals would consist of 3 MREs, for a total of 3,750 calories. This number at first seems significantly higher than it should be, but realize these were designed for men doing extreme physical labor all day long. And through this research, I found that they actually even supplement their diet with tons of energy bars as well, so they're eating more about 5,000 calories a day. And yes, she's a woman with a very slight build, so she would need far fewer calories than a man would doing the same hard manual labor. So we could safely assume the current recommendation of 2,000 calories is roughly what Rey would have needed in this harsh environment. So let's assume that since this is the future, these MREs have, let's say, triple the caloric capacity of our current MREs. So instead of needing 3 meals of 1,250 calories, she only needs to eat 1 single portion to achieve her daily total. Now that we've established what she's eating, her reaction to how much Unkar Pluck gives her becomes much more chilling.
What you brought me today is worth 1/4 portion.
Do you see what that means? Why she looks upset and terrified at the same time? This is likely her only meal every day. She works all day long and gets paid in food in the late afternoon, and he gave her 1/4 of 1 portion. We just figured out that based on current similar foods, 1 portion likely would be roughly 3,750 calories, and he is giving her 1/4 of that, 938 calories. She does hard manual labor all day and is given 938 calories to live off of. That is why she looks so terrified and sad every time he pays her, why she is so excited at the idea of getting 60 full portions. Unkar Pluck is literally starving her to death. Now, yes, Rey mentions how last week the equipment she brought was worth a half a portion each. So we know that these prices were unfair, and sometimes she got enough to eat. But in the first exchange we see, Rey doesn't argue or haggle, which tells the audience that this is normal. This amount of work for this amount of food, this is normal. This is what her life consists of. This is why she is so skinny. She is completely malnourished. This is why she literally licks the plate clean after eating. This is why she is shown eating at Maz's castle. It was an intentional plot point that she was malnourished. But JJ didn't delve deeply enough into the psychological trauma that accompanies this type of constant hunger. Rey would struggle for years with this hunger gnawing at her, both physically and mentally. Even if she had just eaten, she would still be stealing food and hiding it. That's what she's had to do her whole life in order to survive. Twice in my life, I have fasted for a full week, which was enough to give me a small glimpse of true hunger. And it is terrifying. People will eat anything and everything, entire cities resorting to cannibalism, grave robbing, and selling the bodies for food, even eating their own family members. There's a link in the description if you want to read in detail, but be forewarned, this level of starvation is eye-opening and it is terrifying, because once you know the fear of literally starving to death, that's the kind of fear that doesn't easily fade. Why did Rey learn how to fight? This seems like a nitpicky question, but remember, backstory is important. Backstory defines a character. So why did Rey learn how to fight? Why did Rey begin carrying a metal stick as a weapon? She owns nothing, she has no money. All she ever has that's worth stealing is a tiny bit of food that's barely enough to keep anybody alive. So for this young woman who owns nothing, on a planet populated by mainly men, where Rey is literally the only attractive person we ever see, what has this beautiful young woman had to spend her life learning to defend herself against? I only see two possibilities. She was constantly assaulted and stolen from when she was coming back from scavenging, or she was constantly having to defend herself against sexual assault. And considering she is the only young attractive female we see on Jakku with an almost exclusively male population, it is extremely likely that she was sexually assaulted several times over the 14 years that she was on her own. And from the depiction that JJ gave us, this seems blatant. All of the local men stand around and watch, not caring that two full-grown men are ganging up on a young woman. Then there's the juxtaposition of Finn caring about her and the locals not caring, which indicates this happens all the time, that this world exists on a survival of the fittest basis. If you can't protect yourself, no one is going to step in and help you. Then, as further proof, there are two different instances of Rey being angry about Finn holding her hand. On the surface, the explanation is simple. She's a fierce, independent woman who doesn't need a man guiding her. But add together all of the other points of subtext that we have covered, Rey's social isolation, her learning to fight to protect herself, and now her aversion to being touched takes on a completely different meaning.
What are you doing? Come on.
This was possibly the first man she's met that wasn't trying to steal from her or assault her, a man she instantly trusted. And all of a sudden he's touching her without permission and she responds in anger. Based on all of the other subtext the film gave us, the conclusion seems escapable. She is a victim of sexual assault. And if you'd like to slow this down and read, the long-term consequences of Rey living as a victim of sexual assault are just as damaging as her long-term starvation and isolation. And no, I wouldn't have ever said that I want mental trauma and sexual assault to be part of a Star Wars film. But honestly, the way this was done was perfect. All of the hints are there. They're just subtle enough to pick up on. It doesn't derail the story or distract the audience. The only real issue was not continuing Rey's natural character arc, where she learned to overcome these issues. So, we've looked at the childhood trauma that Rey went through, and the traumatic and physical effects of the extreme isolation and constantly being on the verge of starvation. And now we add in the definite possibility that Rey has had to learn to constantly fight off sexual assault her whole life. Now, considering all of that, look at her personality again. She is bubbling happy with a total childlike innocence. Yes, it is possible for someone to suffer extreme trauma and still turn out to be a happy, bubbly person like Rey is, but it's rare. One of the few examples in film I can find is Phoebe from Friends. She has an incredibly sad and traumatic childhood backstory, which is occasionally touched upon. But she is still the most happy and loving character on the show. However, she is definitely the minority. That almost never happens either in real life or in film. When you see a character go through hardships as a child, it always affects them as an adult. What's the first thing Kylo sees when he looks into her mind?
I'm so lonely.
Loneliness. It's been 14 years, and Rey is still tormented by the loss of her family. She is utterly defined by how alone she is, and Kylo sees it.
I'd never felt so alone.
He also mentions that she is desperate to sleep at night. The insight that we get into her hidden personality is completely different than the personality she actually displays to the world. Let's look briefly at just 2 clips of young women who have lived in hostile environments. Nadia from Pandorum and Newt from Alien.
It's all right. It's all right. Come on.
Grab her, Corporal.
Don't be afraid. Come on. We won't hurt you.
Got her. Ow! Damn! Watch her.
Don't let her go!
She's under the grill. Wait!
Don't be afraid. See? Wait! No, you don't. It's okay. You're gonna be all right now.
I know everything about this vault and its systems, but I still can't remember where I grew up, or my brother's name. What? Don't move.
I'm with the flight crew.
Don't you move.
Really, I'm part of the flight crew. We can't just leave him.
He's hunting. You wait for him. Good luck.
Why is Rey so different? These characters all had similar backstories, being abandoned and fending for themselves in a harsh and scary environment. So why are the rest of them distrustful, scared, emotionally reserved, while Rey is bubbly and trusting and generally happy? We could chalk it up to terrible writers, or when you consider the rough childhood that Rey actually had, the film provides sufficient evidence to show that her isolation and abuse have led Rey to cope with reality by reverting to a childlike mental state. Individuals revert to a point in their development when they felt safer and when stress was non-existent, or when an all-powerful parent or another adult would have rescued them. Here are 10 examples that support the theory that as a coping mechanism, Rey has regressed to the mentality of a child. Number 1. She is fixated on staying on Jakku and hoping her family comes back, which is a very passive, dependent action that only a child would take. If Uncle Ben and Aunt Beru had gone missing, would Luke have stayed in their house for 14 years hoping they'd come back? Or would he have gone searching for them? In Episode 2, Anakin is roughly the same age as Rey, yet he doesn't sit around and wait for his mom, he goes looking for her. Padme doesn't sit and wait for someone else to go find Obi-Wan, she goes herself. The adult, mature decision is almost always depicted as taking action, while the childlike depiction is usually staying put and hiding.
Once we get inside, you find a safe place to hide and stay there.
Sure.
Stay there.
Hey, wait for me!
Anakin, stay where you are. You'll be safe there.
But I...
Stay in that cockpit.
If Rey were truly being depicted as an independent, strong-willed woman, she would have left the planet and tracked them down herself. The fact that Rey doesn't take the responsibility herself and remains absolutely fixated on getting back to Jakku and passively waiting for her family is a depiction of an extremely childlike dependence. Number 2. Unless they're in prison trying anything they can do to stay sane, adults don't usually mark off days on a calendar. That's something that kids normally do when they're counting down to something exciting. Adults don't usually keep old toys that they made years ago. Adults don't usually put on helmets and pretend they're fighter pilots. Adults don't usually eat with their fingers and lick their plates. The inclusion of all of these things when we first meet Rey is a very clear indication of her childlike mental state.
I shouldn't have gone in there.
Number 3. She breaks down crying and runs away from Maz instead of facing the reality of the situation like an adult.
I'm never touching that thing again. I don't want any part of this.
A perfect comparison is Mr. Stephen Strange.
Open your eyes.
Teach me.
He was also hurt physically and emotionally. He also experienced a psychedelic, very terrifying vision. The adult thinks rationally about the situation and wants to learn. The child runs away.
Teach me.
I don't want any part of this.
Number 4. Her emotions tend to be very over-enthusiastic. Well-adjusted adults like Leia or Han are much more subdued in their expressions. And actually the same thing happens with Finn. The extremely over-enthusiastic way that both characters react to the world could easily have been a specific acting choice to depict their regressed emotional state, while both of them are trying to remember the stability of their childhood. Number 5. She quickly formed a relationship with a pet-like robot, even giving up food she desperately needed so that she could keep her new pet. This is one of the most nonsensical parts of the film to me. Unkar is literally starving her to death, an orphan who grew up alone without friends. She should have immediately, without thinking, sold BB-8 in exchange for any tiny amount of food, because no friend that you met a day ago compares to the driving, unrelenting hunger pains that she feels every second of every day. It is a very childlike mentality to choose a pet over your own life. And I could link tons of stories about people making the adult decision to get rid of a dog they couldn't afford, but let's skip that sadness and go straight to number 6. She quickly formed intense relationships with a father and mother figure. Look at how excited and proud she is to show him that she solved the problem. Look at how upset she is at Han's death, a man she barely knew, but had immediately formed a deep relationship with. Look at how quickly she formed a bond with Leia. Ever had a youngling you didn't know toddle up and give you a hug? That's really what she reminds me of. Young kids can instantly connect and trust someone in a way that adults can't. And Finn doesn't remember his parents either. Why didn't Finn form a surrogate mother-father relationship the way that Rey did? The obvious answer is that he is coping with his trauma in a different way. He hasn't mentally regressed in the same fashion that she did. Number 7. Her immediate reaction to something being stolen was extreme aggression. She didn't even second guess BB-8.
The jacket! This droid says you stole it.
bashing someone in the face with a metal pole because they're wearing the same style jacket as your friend lost? This was an extremely immature response that most adults would never have. But if you're in elementary school and your friend points and says, "Hey, that kid stole my jacket," you believe them immediately. That's what kids do. Number 8, when you consider how Rey is stuck in a childlike state, so many things in the other films begin to make more sense. Adult women aren't embarrassed by seeing a handsome man with his shirt off, but a young girl might be. Adults don't immediately believe the bad guy and then smack their teacher in the back of his head with a metal pole. But kids believe everything and tend to fight before they have all of the facts. Number 10, it would also explain why Rey is always crying for no reason, because kids can't control their emotions yet. Bonus number 11 that I realized while editing. The first method of self-defense that Rey uses isn't a fancy grappling move or bow staff technique. Her first instinct is to bite. Now, of course, biting is not a tactic that should be ignored in a life or death situation, but the entire purpose of this fight scene is to show that she is a decent fighter that can fend for herself. So if the goal was to depict her as being a competent, self-trained fighter like this guy, why have her begin with a fighting tactic most associated with 2-year-olds? Considering all of the subtext of Rey's backstory, none of these scenes were useful for establishing her character as a strong, independent woman, but all of these scenes were mandatory for establishing her as an emotionally stunted, traumatized victim. This video has just been analyzing the spine of her personality, the core of what she should have been. If we analyzed further and began looking at specific aspects of her character, she makes even less sense. At 5 years old, even if she were a really smart kid, she would just barely have been starting her basic education. Was Rey ever taught to read or write? What about basic math or science skills? How does she know what hyperspace is? How can she scavenge without knowing what these components are called, what they actually do? There's zero chance Unkar Pluck sent her to school or taught her anything. How has she learned to function as such a well-adjusted adult? Does she remember what silverware is? Does she have any concept of what money is? All she's ever done is barter for food. There are only 2 droids and 0 Wookiees on Jakku. How did she learn to speak either? Now, the backstory is that she used training holo recordings that she salvaged herself in order to teach herself how to fly and speak other languages and everything. But that just circles right back around to my main point. The character that she was written to be would never have done these things. Rey would have been focused 100% on surviving. Someone growing up in a harsh environment doesn't even understand the concept of trying to learn and expand your mind and better yourself. And parental encouragement is incredibly important in influencing young kids to study and learn. When we were kids, how many of us actually sat down to study and do our homework unless our parents made us? Did any of you learn 4 different languages before you were 19? On some level, we could all feel that this character doesn't make sense, and the closer you look, the more you see. We have covered a lot of material. From every perspective I can think of, we have analyzed Rey's personality as it should have developed, based on the initially presented spine of her character. So, why did I label her as one of the most wasted characters of all time? Because she still should have turned out to be this same woman. This woman was fierce and brave, loving and kind. She was loyal to her friends, tried to empathize with her enemies. The way she immediately understands and connects with the Force places her among the best Jedi of all time. The problem was that the writers only actually wrote the final version of Rey's character. so she didn't earn any of the positive character changes that I just described. What if Aragorn had never doubted himself and his ability to be king? How interesting would this character be if he didn't have the growth that we saw? What if Peter had never doubted himself in Far From Home? What if he had said, "Tony says I'm the next Tony Stark, darn right, I'm smart and brave enough to take over"? This entire movie changes Peter. He grows up in this film. He trusts himself more because of this film. But Rey? Rey needed the backstory I have laid out for her to have any character development at all. Her friendship with Finn doesn't change her at all. Finally leaving Jakku doesn't change her at all. Realizing she's lived in a desolate wasteland her whole life doesn't change her at all. Finn abandoning her doesn't change her at all. Finn coming back to save her doesn't change her. Her surrogate father dying doesn't change her. Finding out about her parents doesn't change her. Finding out about her parents for real doesn't change her. If Rey had started off as the traumatized character I have described, her journey to eventually become a Jedi would have been a masterpiece, very similar to fan favorite Mara Jade. But Mara didn't complete her character arc in one single book. She struggled throughout the entire trilogy, learning to trust, learning what friendship meant, learning that she is worth loving, learning that her past does not define her. Rey needed a 3-part character arc. In The Force Awakens, she struggles to trust anyone. At every opportunity she tries to steal, not believing for a second that she won't be robbed and stabbed in the back by those now claiming to be her friends. When Finn and Han come to rescue her, she nearly falls to the ground in tears, not believing that someone could ever care about her enough to risk their lives. As the film ends, for the first time in her life, she has hope for the future, she has friends beside her, and finds a master who can train her. In The Last Jedi, Rey's new confidence and hope for life would be tested, as the master she trusted was as broken as she used to be back on Jakku. The knowledge that her parents abandoned her would absolutely crush her spirit, nearly destroying her new outlook on life, and her relationship with Finn would be the one single positive thing that she could cling to. Rise of Skywalker would have the Rey that we are familiar with, as she and her husband Finn are both mentally and emotionally at peace, after years of learning to trust one another. He pulled her out of her despair and isolation, and she pulled him out of the darkness of the First Order's enslavement. Both of their personalities would be completely different from when we first met them. They smile all the time and love making their friends laugh. Their joy would eventually be tested as Finn is kidnapped by the villain in an effort to turn Rey to the dark side. We see pure fury erupt out of her as her 14 years of loneliness flash before her eyes, the thought of losing Finn, of being alone again, driving her completely to the brink of despair. As the villain thinks he has won, Rey remembers who she is. She is not the lost little abused girl living out in the desert. Finn helped her grow beyond that, and as the Jedi of the past stand beside her, Rey defeats the villain, and she and her husband start a new Jedi Academy on a beautiful forest planet where it rains every day and there isn't one single grain of sand. I'm going to cover Finn's wasted character arc in a separate video, and there we'll examine the way that these two characters should have grown together, because they were both traumatized in a very similar way, and the way they should have lifted each other up out of the darkness of their past could have been an amazing story, even more powerful than either story told on its own. A movie about space wizards could have portrayed physical, mental, and sexual abuse in a way that was subtle yet effective. The backstory of Rey is one of the harshest I have ever seen, and her overcoming that trauma could have been the most inspirational story ever told. The evidence, while not conclusive, does indicate that JJ originally wrote Rey as a broken character, someone suffering from PTSD as a result of early childhood trauma, severe isolation, and lifelong physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Unfortunately, her character arc seems to stop at the idea of her being traumatized. Her character suffers nearly no negative consequences of her past trauma. Maybe JJ was forced to give up developing a trauma-riddled character like he initially intended to. Maybe the Disney execs didn't think having a main character suffering through a mental illness was a profitable idea. Maybe her entire character was slapped together in an afternoon, because who cares, it's just a fun flick about space wizards made for kids. I consider Rey to be one of the best examples of any movie of wasted character potential. She could have been so much more. A young woman doing whatever it took to survive, able to trust nobody, a bitter young woman who knows the galaxy is set against her and she can't trust anyone, dealing with the mental issues of child abandonment, abuse, undernourishment, assault, and social isolation. She could have risen above all of that, as she found a friend in another person who had been held captive his whole life, someone who was also abused and alone and suffering. Through learning to trust Finn, Rey would have learned for the first time what friendship was, and we'd have seen her transform in the exact opposite way that Anakin did, from a hate-filled, lonely, hurting person to one who is noble and full of hope and love. This woman is incredibly interesting because this is a deep character, not just a two-dimensional plot device that goes where the story tells her to. This is someone you could watch grow and change and become better than they once were. This character could have been groundbreaking. This is what Rey should have been, instead of what we got. The most wasted character ever written.